Pam, thanks for joining us. What was your reaction when you heard the news of Monday's verdict?
Well, I felt once again really disappointed, but not surprised. I mean, case after case after case, you see scenarios where, there's non-guilty verdicts against people who are alleged to have murdered or otherwise caused the, violence or death against Indigenous peoples. And then when it comes around to investigations, you see police officers from police forces all across the country who aren't doing their job to investigate crimes. And it just seems to be an ongoing pattern, even in 2020.
Some have compared the death of Brady Francis to the Tina Fontaine and Colton Bushy cases. Why do you think the sense of injustice is so strongly felt with these three cases?
I think it's because everyone expected this verdict. I mean, that it's gotten to the stage in Canada, and I mean, we're talking literally about thousands of cases over many decades, where we can predict with a great deal of certainty that there most likely won't be justice in these cases. I mean, first of all, we're not using any Indigenous laws, we're not using any Indigenous court systems or any other kind of conflict resolution systems. It's not Indigenous peoples who are sitting as judges and prosecutors and juries. It's like Indigenous peoples are almost always excluded from the decision-making part of the justice system and are almost always the victims of the justice system. And, it's not like we don't know this. We've had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the Donald Marshall Inquiry, the Upper Wash Inquiry, the Manitoba Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing. We know there's racism in the justice system, but it still isn't being addressed.
Pam, I guess some of the things that you just mentioned there, are those the types of reforms to the Canadian legal system that can make a difference for victims and families in cases like this?
Oh, I think so. Right now, we have absolutely no say and no control over any of these processes. Our laws aren't being used. Our systems aren't being used. We're not decision makers. We're unfairly excluded, even from, the Canadian processes. And I think the more we assert and defend and enforce our own laws over our own territories with our own, justice systems, like they do in the tribal governments in the U.S., the better that we're going to be. At the same time, we also need massive reforms in Canada's justice system. I mean, they have no problem over-incarcerating us at incredibly alarming rates. But when it comes to actually getting justice for victims, it seems to be very few and far between.
Pam, just to switch gears, you've got your YouTube channel and the Your Warrior Life podcast. Today you launched a new podcast for children called Warrior Kids. Can you tell us about the project and how you plan to address issues of injustice with young listeners?
Well, I mean, I'm really, really excited about this because the YouTube channel and the Warrior Life podcast, primarily targeted at adults, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but I was getting so many kids who come up to me at schools or speaking events saying, I listened to your podcast, I wish you had one for kids, I would like to understand this. And teachers all over the country saying, we need more resources to have Indigenous voices teaching about Indigenous issues. And the thing about my podcast, that I'm really trying to promote is that this is education for action. This isn't education for entertainment purposes. This is about teaching Indigenous and non-Indigenous kids how to be social justice warriors and earth justice warriors to have a future for all of us, which will be celebrating everything that's Indigenous, but it's also going to be teaching some of the difficulties that we've had, residential schools and racism and the poverty that we deal with because of the injustice and lack of treaty rights. And I think it's important that kids know that, because ultimately they're going to be the policymakers and lawmakers and decision makers, and we want them to come from a really good grounding.
Well, I'm sure it will be wildly successful. Pam, we'll have to leave it there, but appreciate your time here today.
Thanks for having me.